To get the most out of the webinar, we recommend that you turn off your email, silence your phone, try to remove distractions. I know it's challenging to do in kind of like this era of multitasking, but that's probably the easiest way to get the most out of this. And then 2 is actively engage in the presentation, ask questions. You know, if you have something that you want to ask Crystal while she's presenting, or myself, or Dave when he talks about fire, please do. You know, you can take yourself off mute and ask. You can also type it in the chat we get to at the end. Kind of the folks involved with this webinar series have been Crystal Stiles, who I'll introduce and is going to present, myself. Doug Cluck has been involved with this workshop series a lot from NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information, Denell Peck from the USDA Climate Hub. So lots of great folks with lots of resources in case people want to reach out to any of those folks directly. So just a heads up, at the end of the presentations, we'll definitely open it up for questions and for a discussion, whatever folks are interested in talking about. I'll also go over the BIA Tribal Resilience Program funding, which is due July 6th. There is $46 million currently available for tribal climate resilience work, of which drought falls under. And we can talk briefly about that, and I can give folks more information about where to dig into that content. 46 million is funneled to that funding mechanism through the infrastructure bill that Congress passed. So it's a great opportunity for tribes to be able to take action on some climate change work. Okay, so our speakers today, we've got Crystal Stiles and Dave Martin. Crystal is our first speaker and works for NIDIS. For the past 7 years, Crystal was an applied climatologist with the High Plains Regional Climate Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She directed both the stakeholder and tribal engagement programs there. She also worked on projects with the National Drought Mitigation Center, and Crystal has a PhD in natural resource sciences with a specialization in climate assessment and impacts. Crystal, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Thanks everybody for joining today. Again, as Stefan said, I'm Crystal Stiles. I'm the Tribal Engagement Coordinator with NIDIS. And just a real quick slide, whoops, sorry about that. Just a quick slide on what NIDIS is. We were authorized by Congress in 2006 and have been reauthorized twice since then. And we are an interagency mandate to develop and provide a national drought early warning information system. We typically do that through regional networks, and we have lots of regional partners that we work with. We're really trying to move from this reactive approach to drought, where we're just kind of waiting for it to happen and then we deal with it as it comes, to the more proactive approach, where we're more prepared for it, more aware of what the impacts may be, and maybe be able to even lessen the impacts that we might have in future droughts. And so we work with all levels of government. We work with private, public sector, academic institutions, citizen science, basically anyone who is working in the drought space or needs drought information to make decisions. We try to support that work. So just a little bit of a background there. And now I'm going to move into the conditions. All right, so my presentation is going to be looking at the climate conditions that we have seen basically since the beginning of winter in December. And I just want to point out that last year when we did this series, we really were just focusing on the northern plains because that's really where drought was occurring. But since then, we've had a lot of development of drought in southern portions of the Missouri Basin through Nebraska in particular. And because we have tribes in that region as well, we're actually expanding this to really include all of the Missouri Basin. So you'll see we'll be talking about other parts of the basin as well that are now dealing with drought. So I'm going to go back to early December. The last webinar we had was in early December. And so we really left off with what the fall conditions were. And by December, we're starting to see, especially in the northern plains, ground starts to freeze up. We've ended the growing season, kind of expectedly looking into winter to see what, kind of temperatures and snowfall we might expect. because going into spring, it's really important what those fall conditions were, because essentially moisture in the soil just gets locked in when it freezes up in the winter. So that's why I'm kind of starting where we left off back in December. So this is the U.S. Drought Monitor from December 7th, so about the time we met last. And you can see that the upper part of the Missouri Basin was really dealing with some pretty bad drought. The worst category of drought is that exceptional drought, that D4 kind of crimson color, particularly across a lot of parts of Montana, and then the extreme drought is in the dark red. So that was kind of really, you know, as far as the Missouri River Basin goes, sort of the center of where the worst of the drought was. As you kind of go out toward the lower part of the basin, you could see there was some spotty drought going into winter, but not nearly as severe. And some areas weren't even dealing with dryness at all. That would be all the white spaces. On the right here, this is looking at the class change of the drought monitor. So if we go back to the day that we last met and we look about 3 months before that, that's essentially telling us what improved, what areas improved, what areas got worse throughout the course of the fall. And we see that we saw some intensification of drought conditions across portions of Wyoming here, but over by the Dakotas, we actually had seen some improvement over the fall. So hopefully that kind of gets your mind thinking about, okay, where were we going into winter, which we consider to be December, January, February. So let's talk about winter. So in climatology, we typically look at winter as December, January, February. So these maps are from the High Plains Regional Climate Center, and they're looking at departure from normal temperature and then percent of normal precipitation. So for the winter, you can see that the upper Missouri Basin was much warmer than normal. So normal meaning the last 30-year period that we use to compare with, which is 1991 to 2020. So pretty warm winter for the most part, especially across eastern parts of Montana, North Dakota, northern portions of South Dakota. So quite a few tribal lands in these areas that experienced a warm winter. And then it's really no surprise then when we look at precipitation, it really was very dry during the winter. So all the red and crimson areas we're seeing 25 to 50% below normal of precipitation for what they should expect. Now just notice if we kind of get down the lower portion of the basin, the winter was actually a little bit wetter, like across Nebraska, and cooler as well in the lower portions of the basin. So winter conditions for that area were really, as far as drought's concerned, we're looking okay. So the National Centers for Environmental Information put out these monthly ranking maps, and they do it by state. And so I just to kind of show you the rankings, what does this really mean for winter, for example. The one on the left is looking at what was kind of the statewide average temperature range. And if we go back 127 years, that's how much data that we have to compare it to. So it actually ranks all of the states and kind of gives you an idea, were they near average, above, much above, close to record, or below. So for temperature, generally the middle and lower parts of the basin were a little above average for temperature in the winter, but it was nothing record breaking. Pretty much near average in the upper portion of the basin. But when you look at precipitation, it's really all over the place for the basin. It's really interesting to see how wet, North Dakota was above average for precipitation in the winter, but then you just come down to Nebraska and Kansas, and they had their 4th and 5th driest winters on record, respectively. So that was really a really stark contrast in just going a little further north and seeing it, being kind of wet there. So Montana was pretty much near average for the winter. And again, these are statewide averages. This is not going to reflect any local conditions. So just keep that in mind when you see these numbers. So we don't have the complete picture of spring yet. The spring months are March, April, and May. We're just about finished with spring climatologically, but we don't have those maps yet. So I just went back the last 90 days, which is fairly close to what the spring season was. You know, again, looking at temperature and precipitation. The last 3 months, generally the spring months have been pretty cool across the basin, especially like North Dakota. You see the blue areas, and I apologize, I cut off that legend, but I think that is like, you know, a few, maybe 2 to 3 degrees or so, maybe 4 degrees below normal. And then the green areas were slightly below normal for temperature too. But if you look at precipitation, again, we see a big contrast here. North Dakota, parts of South Dakota really got a wet spring this year. And you may remember not too long ago, there were some pretty heavy snowstorms, blizzards that happened in April across these upper portions of the basin. And so that is really largely driving what you're seeing in this map. It was some of those huge systems that brought 20 to 30 inches of snow in April. But if you look at the rest of the basin, it was very dry, especially across southern parts of South Dakota, much of Nebraska into Kansas, all really contended with pretty dry winters this year. So going back to those rankings, you know, again, I can't show you the 3-month spring ranking yet, but we can look by month. So March is our first month of spring. And looking at temperatures, you know, parts of the basin, again, a little bit warm during March, but nothing record breaking. Some areas in the white you see were pretty much near average for temperatures. But then if you look at precipitation, most of the basin was a little dry. North Dakota was very dry in March at 7th driest March on record. But then if we go to April, we see a very different story. April was very cool and very wet for northern portions of the basin. Montana had its 5th coldest April on record. North Dakota had its 8th coldest. You know, other portions of the basin were generally below normal temperatures in April too. And then again, we see this huge stark contrast in precipitation in April. Again, where we saw all of those crazy snowstorms up in the northern plains, that resulted in North Dakota as a state had its 2nd wettest April on record since 1895. So very impressive. But again, you don't have to go too far south into southern portions of the basin. We saw it was really dry in April. Kansas had its 3rd driest March on record, and Colorado had its, April. And Colorado had its 5th driest April on record. All right, so what have we seen in May? So just looking back, just since the beginning of the month, typically a lot of that cool pattern has kind of persisted in the upper Missouri Basin, but you see it's really warmed up. We've had pretty warm May, down more toward the lower portions of the basin. But if you look at you know, the percent of normal precipitation, a very large portion of the basin has been pretty dry this month, you know, with exceptions of eastern Montana, parts of North Dakota, northern South Dakota. We've really seen actually be a quite wet wet May. So we're seeing some big differences across the basin in those conditions. So what's been going on with mountain snowpack this year? So we like to look in the upper Missouri River Basin. You know, it tells us a lot about what water supply we're going to have for the year. You know, what is going to run off? You know, what rivers are going to flood, or are they not going to flood? So it's really important that we look at that mountain snowpack. And so this data is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the graphics are showing you, we can look at the first one. So this is looking at the upper Missouri Basin above Fort Peck. And the blue shading, that is what we've actually experienced this year. And this is snow water equivalent. And so what that means is if you took the snowpack and just instantaneously melted it down to water and measured that, that's the equivalent of the water. And we have to do that because some snow can be really packed with moisture, and some of it's a really dry snow and has very little moisture. So it's really important that we know what the snow water equivalent is. And so if we look at this blue area, if you compare it to the red line is the 1991 to 2020 average. We see that, and really we're seeing almost a mirror image in that part from Fort Peck to Garrison. Snowpack was pretty much below average through most of the year. But what's really interesting is we typically expect these areas to see peak snowpack more around mid-April or so. Well, they actually peaked much later than usual this year. And again, thinking about all of those big snowstorms that we've seen later in the season has a lot to do with that. So down here in the text, it actually tells you, about where they peaked. So above Fort Peck, it peaked at about 74% of normal. So that means, and then you can see that big gap right here. We didn't get as much snowpack as would have been expected. Fort Peck to Garrison got about 85% of its normal peak. So it was also a little bit below normal on peak for the year. But if you look at the dates, the normal peak for both reaches about April 17th. But the total above Fort Peck actually peaked on April 29th, so a couple of weeks late. And then from Fort Peck to Garrison, it peaked, May 3rd or so. So we really have seen a late peak in the snowpack this year, and this area is still holding a lot of snowpack right now. So what about plain snowpack? So these maps are generated from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. We're looking at what's the percent of mean for snowfall. And I have, this map is, I say July 1st because that's the beginning of the snow season officially, up to today. This is showing us where snowfall has generally been above or below normal this year. We can see the areas in the upper parts of the basin, again in North Dakota, where there was a lot of snow this season, much above normal. But then you go down toward the lower part of the basin, and it was very much below normal. I picked out April to show you just because April was so anomalous, where you see these purple areas in the northern plains, areas getting 750% of their mean snowfall, which is a lot. So it was very, very anomalous April, but you can see that a lot of areas didn't even get any snow at all in April in parts of the basin. So very interesting to see that. Streamflow conditions from the U.S. Geological Survey. Stream flows are pretty high, in parts of North Dakota, again, where they've had a lot of heavy precipitation. So they're seeing a lot of higher stream flows, and then some in the lower portion of the basin too. We do see some lower stream flows in the lower percentiles. You see quite a few here in western Montana. And it's probably misleading because we were just talking about how the snowpack in that area is still pretty high, but that's really in the high elevations. The lower elevations, really didn't get nearly that much snow this year. So there's a lot of dry, very much below normal streams out there, as well as in some areas in Nebraska and Kansas as well. So looking at soil moisture, this is really important when we think about the growing season, which has already started. The moisture is not looking very good. So looking at the end of the week ending May 15th, you look across the basin, and this is showing the percent of topsoil moisture that's short to very short. So these are your lowest, driest categories. 73% of Montana, the topsoil moisture is short to very short. That is quite a lot. And so these darker browns are telling us these are areas where soil is a lot drier. North Dakota looking pretty good at this point with all the precipitation up there that they've received. The spring has really helped considerably. The one on the right is subsoil moisture. Topsoil moisture can change conditions quickly. It can dry out very quickly. It can saturate very quickly. Subsoil moisture, however, takes longer to change. So a lot of times topsoil moisture might be more indicative of short-term conditions, where subsoil moisture, I think if you're thinking about more long-term conditions, that's kind of what's telling the story. So we're seeing that the subsoil is also, very dry across much of the basin. Again, except for North Dakota, where a lot of that snow melt has been able to trickle into the soil. But we've really started the growing season very, very dry soil across the basin. And then just another couple of things about soil moisture. This is just one of the many different soil moisture models out there that looks at like remotely sensed data. And it's looking at 0 to 100 centimeters soil moisture percentile. And I think it really tells the story of, how wet parts of North Dakota and in the northern part of the plains have been in the past few months. We're really seeing that wet signal in the soil, but as you go throughout other parts of the basin, the dark yellows, reds, and so forth, we're seeing very low soil moisture percentiles there. I also put out the pasture range conditions. So now those are being published for the year, and they get published weekly by the USDA. And so I just picked, a majority of the states across the basin, looking at what percent of pasture and rangeland is being rated poor to very poor. And you can see some pretty high totals here, like Montana, 3/4 of the state, those pastures are not in good condition. It's about half or so of the state for Colorado and for Wyoming, and close to that for South Dakota. Nebraska has been getting worse, so their pastures are not looking good there from the recent dryness. It's really, Kansas and North Dakota pastures are better. Again, we've seen so much improvement of drought conditions across North Dakota that it's really being reflected in those conditions there. So what is the current drought depiction now? This was the May 17th map that was produced last week. So the next one will be released on Thursday morning this week. But we can see, again, a pretty good portion of the basin is dealing with some level of drought. We see where a lot of it's been kind of eradicated across parts of the Dakotas. It's also still fairly wet down in the lower portion of the basin. But I think this map on the right is very telling. This is looking at that drought monitor class change. And so this is looking at now going back to the beginning of winter and how have conditions changed. And we've seen, again, a very stark contrast across the basin. We've seen a lot of improvement of drought conditions, at least meteorologically, in the northern plains. But down, in lower parts of the basin, we've seen a lot of degradation of drought. And a lot of that has happened very recently as conditions have just continued to deteriorate. So I wanted to give you some examples and put out there, the U.S. Drought Monitor does have tribal reservations. So if you want to look at the drought monitor just at the tribal reservation level, you can do that. And I've got the website to the drought monitor. If you go to the map archive, that's usually where you can find those tribal areas. So I just picked out a few of the tribal lands, and this is comparing 2 different weeks. And essentially, I just took the most recent U.S. Drought Monitor map, and then I'm comparing it back to the beginning of December to see where we've been. So these are looking at the Fort Belknap and Fort Berthold reservations. And you see that where we were, that's the one that's on the right. Like Fort Belknap, most of the reservation was dealing with exceptional drought, or that worst category. In December, we've seen a little bit of improvement in that area, but not a lot. So now the entire reservation's in the D3 extreme drought category. If you look at Fort Berthold, though, you can see some pretty big changes beginning in December. they were going into the winter at D2 or severe drought. But then if you look now, most of the reservation is completely drought free. There's just the western area that's really just contending with some abnormal dryness, which is probably, you know, a signal of it starting to come out of that meteorological drought. Now, here's a couple other reservations that have seen degradations in drought conditions since the beginning of December. The one on the left is the Rosebud Reservation. Going into winter, the reservation was dealing with some abnormal dryness, but now the entire reservation is in drought, with even some areas that are dealing with severe drought. And then the one on the right is the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska, almost completely drought and dryness free going into winter, but we've already seen these changes to where now the reservation is in severe drought. So I really encourage you to go to the Drought Monitor's website, to that map archive, and you just, when you go to the area type, you go to tribal areas, and then the federally recognized reservations will pop up. It's a really great feature that was added last summer. If you want to look at that, a lot of great products there. Okay, so hopefully that gave you kind of a good, you know, an overview of what we've really been seeing since winter and spring. And so now let's talk about what we're expecting to see this summer with the outlooks. So from the Climate Prediction Center, this is the June temperature and precipitation outlooks. And these are all based on probabilities. They take into account a lot of things. They'll take into account like soil moisture conditions, you know, and like the various models, forecasting models, and look at a lot of, you know, recent conditions and so forth. So a lot of things that go into it. But for the month of June, it's looking like probably middle and lower parts of the basin are going to be warmer than typically it is in June. Far northern parts of the basin, it's about equal chances that it could be, you know, warmer than normal, near normal, or below normal. If we look at precipitation, again, part of the basin here is looking like precipitation will be below normal, whereas northern parts of the basin, pretty much equal chances in June of it being wetter, drier, or near normal for the month of June. Now, if we look at summer as a whole, which is the months of June, July, and August, it doesn't look good. Temperatures almost across the entire contiguous U.S. are expecting to see a much warmer summer this year. Unfortunately, these models, they don't tell us how much warmer it would be, just that it would be above the normal that's expected. And then looking at precipitation, you know, it does not look good for the Missouri Basin. Really expecting, you know, below normal precipitation through those areas. And that's really concerning because these are, you know, the Missouri Basin is an area where we typically expect to hopefully see our greatest precipitation during spring and summer months. And so if we're not getting it then, it's really hard to make it up in other parts or other times of the year. The summer drought outlook then, of course, you know, does not look good either. So really showing all the brown areas is telling us that these are areas that are currently in drought, and we're expecting to see it persist through the summer. The white areas, these were areas that are not in drought. It's not expected that these areas will develop drought again. However, these always change, so you definitely want to keep up with the outlooks to see if there are changes. The yellow areas are places where drought development is likely this summer. So a few pockets in Wyoming and Colorado that aren't dealing with drought now, it will probably get filled in and they'll be dealing with it. And then you can see a little bit of an eastern extension of you know, areas that are not currently in drought, like in southeast Nebraska, you know, into Iowa. They're probably going to be dealing with drought conditions by the end of the summer. And then finally looking at wildfire outlook, and David Martin from BIA is going to tell you more about wildfires, but the outlook is not looking good with the warm and dry conditions. In June, we're definitely seeing kind of in upper portions of the basin, we're probably going to see above normal fire activity. But when we get into July and August is really when we see it cranking. Really large portions of the basin are probably going to contend with above normal fire conditions this year or this summer. All right, so in summary, I know that was a lot of information that I threw at you, but hopefully these 3 points here will help drive it home. Heavy snows, especially in the late spring, think about those major blizzards that happened in April in the northern plains. That really did help improve drought conditions across upper portions of the basin. Meanwhile, warm and dry and practically snowless conditions over the same time period caused drought to develop and intensify in lower portions of the basin. We have entered the growing season with depleted soil moisture across vast portions of the basin. So that is not good for crops. Pasture and range conditions, they vary across the basin, but we talked about a lot of places really dealing with really bad pasture conditions. And again, a lot of that is really just carryover from last year. The summer outlook does not bode well for drought improvement. We're expecting warm and dry conditions across much of the basin. So therefore, we're expecting drought to persist in parts of the basin that are dealing with drought right now. Probably going to see a little bit more development of drought across areas of Colorado and Wyoming, and then those eastern areas of South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. And then wildfires will be a concern across drought-stricken areas this summer. And one last point I want to make before I stop is that when I say, the droughts improve, this is really talking meteorologically. So we've gotten a lot more precipitation to help make up the deficit. However, there are a lot of ongoing drought impacts because drought in some of these areas has been ongoing for the past couple of years. That does not necessarily mean the drought is over. It just means that those areas have gotten more precipitation to help make up the deficit that they had. But I expect there to be a lot of lingering impacts, and then some of those impacts that might have kind of abated in the winter may be coming back this summer as well. So I wish I had better news for you, but I hope that you found that helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Stefan.
Thanks so much, Crystal. Yeah, folks have any questions for Crystal? We can take a couple right now. I don't see any in the chat, but if you want to take yourself off mute and ask a couple questions before we get to Dave, feel free. I appreciate you setting the stage, Crystal, for the impacts, kind of knowing what is happening currently, and then also the outlooks. All right, let's go to Dave. Dave Martin is the Regional BIA Fire Manager for the Great Plains region. Dave's based in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and he's worked in fire for 23 years. Dave's been on one of our webinars before, and we appreciate him giving such great info about what fires look like for the region. So Dave, go ahead and take yourself off mute and feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Stefan. And good afternoon, folks. Crystal, do you have a good copy on me?
I'm sorry, say that again.
I was just making sure you and I had good combo. Can you bring up the hilltop fire picture, if you would, please?
Yeah, might take me just a second. I've got several.
Okay.
So let me find it here real quick.
Yep. Just a quick intro for everybody on the presentation. My name's David Martin. Thanks, Stefan, for the intro. I've been in fire for 27 years in my federal firefighting career. And I've been in the Great Plains Region BIA out of the Aberdeen office for 13 going on 14 years. We've seen our share of big fires, both big and small, come and go. But we're going to be covering some things that we're going to be looking at for the outlook, segueing from Crystal's forecast and her information. But we're going to look at what makes big problematic fires. We're going to cover that. And we're going to be looking at, let's go with Crystal, let's go with the fire conditions. Paper doc, if you could bring that up.
All right, sorry about that. I had just pulled up the hilltop fire picture.
Yeah, no worries. I already got past my intro, so we can go right to the
Okay,
fire
sorry about
condition. Yeah,
All right, tell me again, which paper am I bringing up?
it's the fire conditions, critical fire conditions.
Okay.
Yep.
Give me just 1 second.
Bear with us, folks. We're getting this online here, so. Yeah, as soon as you get that up, we'll go into, there it is, right there. Okay. For us to look at what we're expecting to experience this year, this fire season, going into the summer, from the spring, we got to look at what conditions have to be present for us to have large problematic fires. Okay, and this is what we've learned over the course of time. Basically, fire weather is our biggest concern usually. Temps usually 30 degrees, 32 degrees, freezing or warmer. And this is not as critical as an NCEI is expected that we've learned over time. Relative humidity is critical. Usually at the 30% or less level becomes explosive in the high plains area. And the further south you go in the central and southern plains, it's the same situation. Wind speeds are usually 25 miles per hour or greater. And that's usually during red flag warnings and high wind watches and warnings that we become really, really concerned as conditions worsen in a given period of time in a location. Also, and we'll discuss this later, is dry lightning starts to occur in the summer months with drought present over some of our largest areas in West River, typically West River, South Dakota, and North Dakota typically, and have occurred typically in July, usually in the past 2012, 2016, 2017, 2021. We had some dry lightning fires that occurred were some of the largest that we've ever had in our history. Sliding down, we start to look at fuel conditions. These are general guidelines. Cured rates of grassland fuels at 50% cure rates or higher, 50 to 100% is most critical. I've also listed live fuel moistures in 1 hour, 10 hour, 100-hour fuel moistures. And you can see the rates there, and anything lower becomes critical, and also the fine dead fuel moisture as well at 8% or lower. Typically, we go with the cured rates of grassland fuels as our basic guideline, and you can visually look at that on a landscape. Sliding down, drought conditions, this becomes imperative. D1, D2, D3, and D4 indices are present within given areas. Due to the lack of soil moisture, fires can burn deep, both vertically and horizontally in the root systems of grass, brush, and tree root systems below ground level. What makes this dangerous is drought impacts are not readily visible to the above ground firefighting resources. They can't see it unless they have been instructed and informed of these problems. General rule of thumb is the more drier the level of drought is, the highest the possibility of older fires can and will rekindle up to even 7 to 10 days in age after they started. You know, you look at grassland fuels and a fire can rekindle 7 to 10 days, even up to 2 weeks later. And that usually catches people off guard. Monitoring the old fire scars collectively in a big landscape on top of dealing with the new fires becomes overwhelming for the local fire management organizations at the community, county, state, tribal, and federal staffing levels. Here's some examples of what we learned. 2012 fire season for our South Dakota, Nebraska agencies and state and federal ground. There was 9 type 1, type 2 large fires that occurred in the summer season of 2012. D2, D3, and D4 drought was present over the summer timeline. And our biggest fire was the Longhorn Complex at Rosebud. That was 30 plus lightning strikes that burned up a total of 43,000 plus acres of ground in a week and a half period of time. Very dangerous timeline. For the whole fire season of 2012, which has been our most active and driest year, we had over 2,300 fires that burned almost 139,000 acres of ground. Very critical timeline. Our next fire season that's been the most active and critical was last year, our fire season in North Dakota and South Dakota. And Crystal, that's one thing I wanted to bring up. Last year, this time, North Dakota was the driest. South Dakota was next driest, and Nebraska was actually the least driest. But this year, it's inverse. North Dakota got all that snow and rain in April, so they're the wettest. Thankfully, they're getting a break. South Dakota is now the next driest, and then Nebraska is even drier. So it's kind of the inverse this year, what we're dealing with now versus what we dealt with last year. But 2021 was a very active fire season for us. Over 1,500 fires, which burned almost 133,000 acres. Okay. And D2 and D3 drought were present over the bulk of that timeline. Fort Berthold Agency had the largest fire last year that burned 10,300 acres, and it was from a hot coal seam in the ground, lighting up drought impacted fuels. Also want to slide down into April 2022, that was last April in Nebraska. 14 counties had a big firestorm from April 22nd to the 24th. 5 large complexes in the south central and northeastern areas of the state. The Road 702 fire was the largest at over 43,000 acres burned. D2 and D3 drought was present. Fire made almost an 80-mile run and burned 6 homes. And that was in a 2 or 3 day window. So Nebraska really got hammered in the end of April. Something to be aware of. As we progress, they are getting a little bit of rain down there, but they're still looking like they're going to get hotter and drier over the summer, which is a problem as far as what Crystal had forecasted in her presentation. Sliding down, I've got to mention that we go by the National Fire Danger Rating System. 2016 version 4 is new. We're having problems with this system. They're revamping it. So the critical part to keep in mind about the National Fire Danger Rating System, the new version, is that when we get to the 90th and 97th percentile rates for both energy release component and the burning index indices that we monitor off our RAWS GOES 12 weather system stations that we use, basically when we start to hit the 90th percentile up to the 97th percentile and above, we start to get critical in our fire activity and our fuels conditions. Energy release component, for those folks that don't know what it is, it's basically the heat you feel off the flaming front of the head of the fire. Burning index is the measure of fire intensity, and it's basically a hybrid of both spread component and energy release component together. And that basically is an estimation of your flame lengths on a point source given fire. That being sliding down, general trigger points for drought indices as it relates to ERC BI percentile levels, there is a correlation. D1 is usually between the 80th and 90th percentile rates for both ERC and BI for NFDRS. D2, you start to approach the 90th percentile level. D3, you're between the 90th and 97th percentile levels. And D4 is above the 97th percentile and super dangerous and critical. So as a basic guideline, we're still monitoring our ERCs and BIs, but we're waiting for the system to, number one, modify to the new version. And by the way, we do need more money for more RAWS data stations in our area. We do have holes in our land base. Sliding down, state, county level fire danger indexes to monitor and follow. And by the way, folks, this paper and these pictures and the 2 papers that I'm presenting on, everybody can have access to these, and they can even be included in my emails that I send out to the field every Thursday for the new drought maps. And I can get you this basic info if it's so desired. State, county level fire danger, how do we communicate our fire danger to the local county, tribes, counties, state level, and even down to the community level? One way we can do that is with these state, county level fire danger indexes. And there's one for North Dakota, one for South Dakota, one Nebraska. So we can use those, and you can open those links and you can see those are daily indexes with maps of the state and county level burn restrictions and fire danger ratings. And those fire danger ratings go from low, moderate, high, very high, and extreme. Where I start to be concerned is when we start to hit the high level or above. That's where I start to get concerned with those indexes. Sliding down, lessons learned from 16 years of fire history for our regional area. When we look at all of these combined conditions, the fire weather condition I listed above, the cured fuels, the drought impacts from D1, D2, D3, and D4 level, ERCs and BIs approaching the 90th percentile or higher, and of course, the state level fire danger indexes to monitor and follow at North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska at the high level, very high, or extreme. When all these conditions combine, all at one time over a big area on a state level, county level map, and then you take and overlay that high wind map, high critical red flag warning map over the drought map that's there for the week, you start to see the critical areas, okay? And that's where we start to mobilize resources to get prepared and not get caught flat-footed like what happened in Nebraska. We're trying to help folks not get caught unprepared. As long as they know what's coming, the high winds, the low RHs, the wind speeds above 30 mile an hour, the drought is there, already there, the cured fuel conditions, all of that, when that starts to bottleneck, that's where your large fires are going to go greater than average chance. They're going to go 1,000 acres or larger in severity for fires and fire sizes. Okay. And again, what we call a large fire is 1,000 acres or larger, so for the sense of the presentation. Okay. Can you have a large fire without drought? That question gets asked by me or gets asked to me quite a bit off and on. Folks don't understand where drought plays that role. Drought is a significant factor that plays a role in resisting, contain, and control operations and has really actually assisted in our fires going large over courses of time. If you slide down on the document, you'll see the dry lightning strike started wildfires are underlined. This is critical. And this is coming up in the end of June, going into July and August. Dry lightning strike started wildfires have been our largest and most dangerous fires to date to deal with over the 12 million acre land base that we manage fires for. Our biggest in the last 10 years, in the last decade, is the Longhorn Complex out of Rosebud. That went 43,000 plus acres. And the Freeman Fire at Pine Ridge. Those were started by lightning strikes, and they were in D1 to D3 drought indices present for each area and each fire. And we learned a big lesson on those actual fires. Another lesson on the other end of the extreme is, can you have fires in the middle of winter? Absolutely. If you slide down, there was the Legion Lake fire that occurred in December of 2017 in the southern end of the Black Hills. What was present was D1 moderate drought, high winds, and 100% cured fuels, no snow cover, and allowed that fire to burn a total of 53,000 acres in December. And it caught everybody flat-footed because it was outside their normal fire season timelines. So we don't want to get caught off guard. We want to be better prepared, and that's how we do so. We've identified the critical conditions. Crystal, could you go over to the next doc, the drought variables impacts? We can go from there.
Give me just a second.
Yep. There we go. All right, looking good. Okay, next doc. And again, these documents are going to be available for folks to utilize in the future. Drought impacts in the Great Plains region. Some of this we've already covered. We're going to cover this pretty quickly so we can move to the question and answer segment. Obviously, drought does play a significant role for us in our regional area for our workloads on the number of fires and how many burned acres we have per year. If I can go back and look at our top 5 most active fire seasons, if you look back going to 2012 to the present, we got 10 years. Our most active fire year was 2012. The next one was 2021, which was last year. The next one was 2016, then 2017, and then 2015. And that was our top 5 fire seasons. 2012 is still king though, so far. So that being said, going into the drought impacts, this is how we deal with these conditions and how we've overcome them in the past. Lightning strike starter fires are becoming an issue for many agencies on element number 1. This is where that Longhorn complex, the biggest fire at Rosebud in 2012, 43,000 plus acres. It was 40 lightning strikes in their timber reserve, and it all came together and burned over a week and a half. That fire went type 2, very dangerous fire. Sliding down to element number 2, flare-ups and spot fires are occurring along all and beyond all the fire perimeters on all new initial attack and extended attack older fires. Monitoring the old fire scars for rekindling possibilities becomes critical. Sliding down to element number 3. Got a little crazy here, hold on. Rekindling of older fires over the 7 to 10 day timeline, even up to 2 weeks. Those are issues that we deal with these drought conditions. Number 4, more firefighting time and resources are needed to safely contain and control our fires. And that usually overwhelms our local folks if we're not planning ahead of time and getting more resources in with our short-term and long-term severity budget requests to do that. Okay, number 5, all levels of fuel classifications, your small 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, 1,000 hour, 10,000 hour big fuels are all burning to completion. Deep white burning ash pits are in these areas that have all levels of fuels and they're burning to completion. When you see that, you've got no decent soil moisture in the ground to keep the fire from going deep. Here's the biggest one of all, number 6, fires go underground both vertically and horizontally into the root systems of burning grass, brush, and timber fuel models due to the lack of soil moisture values to keep the fires from going deep. Okay, mop-up operations are impacted by how much time and resources are needed to safely put those fires out. In a non-drought year, we typically don't need all those resources at that time to put fires out because fires can't go deep with the soil moisture being adequate. Number 7, this is where we start to modify and we've learned our lessons big time. Motor graders, dozers, farm tractor discs, and skid steers with blades are needed to put in bladed fire lines around the perimeters to mineral soil to effectively stop fires from flaring up and or rekindling, making new fire runs a problematic issue. If you don't have bladed equipment, then basically fires are going to want to rekindle along the cold black edge of the fire perimeters. They look like they're secure, but later on they can rekindle, causing more issues. This is where we bring in fire aviation resources on number 8. It's expensive to bring in these aviation resources. We have to be justified in doing that and looking at our conditions, tracking weather, fuels conditions, and drought, ERCs, BIs. All of that plays a role when we put in long-term severity requests to bring in aviation to offset and monitor all these areas because we're covering lots of landscape looking for new fires and lightning strikes during the summer months. July is critical. Okay, number 9 and 10 are the most probably important parts of this document as I close this. We have found that increasing widespread communication, thus this webinar and others and the emails I send out through various email messages, phone calls, team meetings, Zoom webinars, we have assisted us with giving advance warning to all folks at local community, county, state, tribal, federal, and even national level folks. And we give them the heads up of what we're facing and what we're dealing with. We can do this months in advance. In fact, I knew by last fall that we'd be looking at the possibility of putting in more severity requests this spring and summer if we continued on the drying trend. And it looks like we have, according to Crystal's forecast. So all that being said, we've been gearing up and getting ready for this almost a half a year in advance. And it gives us the chance to get the money needed to expand our operations to deal with these conditions to keep fires small. That's critical. Okay. Number 10, short-term severity and long-term severity funding requests. This has been key to our success. But we have to know ahead of time what conditions we're facing, drought, fuel conditions, weather conditions, fire weather conditions, even the burning indexes and the ERCs and BIs, all that play a role in justifying us getting $500,000 to $1 million long-term severity request to bring in fire aviation, heavy equipment, and more ground resources and our big areas of concern that we got to cover for these possible large fire incidences. Okay. All right, Crystal, I've covered a lot of ground here. You want to bring up the Fort Totten fires pick, if you would, please, or no, excuse me, bring up the RBA lightning map. Do you
And
have
let's-
that real quick?
Dave, while we're trying to pull that picture up, let's open it up to any questions.
Okay. How are we doing on time, Stefan?
We've got about a minute left. So if folks do have any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute, or you can type them in the chat. Yeah, Dave, why don't you cover this picture, and then, yeah, we got about a minute left, so.
Okay, copy that. Just as an example for what we deal with in the times of July, this is a lightning strike, air to ground lightning strike, but what we deal with over a large area. That's the Rosebud Indian Reservation, below south of the White River and north of obviously the Nebraska state line. But that gives you an example. This occurred back in 2017 in July. This is what we deal with. That's why we're bringing aviation to look for these new fire strikes. And when this occurs over the drought impacted ground, big fires can occur. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave. It was a great overview of fire in the region. Looks like we don't have any questions. Again, if you do have one, feel free to type it in. I also put Dave's email in the chat in case you want to reach out to him directly.
Yep. Do you want to go ahead and put my phone number in there as well, Stefan?
Sure.
Okay, it'd be 605-216-3418. Folks can contact me direct if they have any questions on any part of this presentation.
Thanks so much, Dave. And thank you, Crystal, for both of your presentations. Thanks so much to everyone who joined today. I typed also in the chat the YouTube link and where the recording will be located if folks missed pieces or want to return to any piece of information. I'm also just going to put in the chat real quickly. There is a BIA funding announcement available for tribal nations and tribal organizations currently to do climate adaptation work, including and implement climate adaptation plans. So feel free to go to that link. There's a ton of information there where you can dig into the different categories. And there's a webinar that's recorded on there that you can listen to that covers the frequently asked questions. And with that, we are going to close. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and thanks again for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Crystal and Stefan.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Crystal.